webinar series. QEERI, as you know, is the Qatar Environment and Energy Research Institute. We are part of Hamad bin Khalifa University, and we are delighted to be here with you this morning to organize a webinar series related to COVID-19 and the work that we do and the research that is existing from around the world on this very important topic. So, without much further ado, let's move on with this morning's webinar. I am Dilraz Kunumal. I manage the PR and communications at QEERI, and I will be your moderator for today. All right, before we get into the real part of the webinar, a few housekeeping items that we need to discuss. So once again, thank you so much for joining QEERI's webinar on demystifying the links between COVID-19 response and the local air quality. Just some things to keep in mind. Please ensure that your microphones are muted. It is automatically muted when you join the session, and only the host can unmute them. Please ask as many questions as you can. You can type them into the Q&A window, and we will answer it at the end of the webinar, and we will not be taking any questions in between to ensure that we get the maximum benefit out of this, that all of you as participants get the maximum benefit out of this webinar. Please also note that obviously we can only answer questions which are relevant to us as QEERI, and today's topic in particular is air quality. So questions related to air quality will be answered. Any medical or clinical questions will obviously not be answered because we are not medical experts. Our team is filled with researchers and scientists, and they can talk to you about the science of it. If you have medical questions, we are probably not the right people for that. All right. The webinar is indeed being recorded, and it will be shared on HPKU's video portals in the near future. If you're posting about us on social media, and please do, we would really appreciate it if you can. The hashtag to use is hashtag QEERI webinar. The session is expected to last 1 hour, but of course, if you have more questions, we'd be happy to stay around a little longer to answer as much questions as possible. And, sometimes the view is an issue, especially if you're watching on your laptop. You will find this little button on the top right corner of your screen, and you can use that to manage the view. Okay, then. So before I invite today's speaker, I just want to talk about the schedule we have of webinars within QEERI. We have 3 webinars this week, today, which is Sunday, on Tuesday, and on Thursday. So today we obviously have Dr. Mohammed Ayub. He's the Senior Research Director for the Environment and Sustainability Center. On Tuesday, that's in 2 days from today, which is May 5th, we have our Senior Research Director for the Water Center, Dr. Jenny Lawler, talking about the water perspective and how the impact and the value for water research is to a global health crisis. The last webinar we have planned as part of this series is by Dr. Veronica Bermudez. She's the Senior Research Director for the Energy Center at QEERI, and she will talk about the contribution of energy-related research to address the COVID-19 crisis and beyond. Okay, so today's star is Mohammed Ayub. He is the Senior Research Director for the Environment and Sustainability Center, as I just mentioned. He has over 20 years of experience as an atmospheric scientist, and he has worked in air quality, climate change research, and his experience has spanned academia, technology development, regulatory agencies, international consulting, and even the United Nations. He is a father of 5, and as such, he's absolutely passionate about leaving a positive environment and a thriving environment for the future generation. He will be supported by his team, Dr. Christos Fontokis, who is a senior scientist with the ESE Center, and Dr. Azar Siddiq, who's also a scientist with ESE. So, without much further ado, I am going to hand over the reins to Mohammed for his presentation today. So, like I mentioned, the format would be that Mohammed will present, followed by question and answers that we will take. Mohammed, if you are ready, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Dilraz. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you wherever you are. Ramadan Mubarak to those who are observing the month. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm really excited to go through this with you. We're going to be talking a little bit about QEERI, the Qatar Environment and Energy Research Institute, who we are as an institute and the kind of research that we do. You can see in front of you here the full kind of scope of the research that's conducted at QEERI. I am the Senior Research Director of the Environment Sustainability Center. where we run 4 programs in air quality, climate change, water quality, and sustainability. Today's topic, of course, is focused on air quality. Get that moving forward. So let's talk a little bit about what we hope to get out of today's webinar. The idea is to give you an understanding of Qatar's specific social distancing strategy and contact tracing, how that impacts some of the numbers that we're seeing, and of course, how that relates to air quality in terms of how social distancing impacts air quality and the impacts of air quality on the Greater Doha area. We're also going to be looking at what we can learn from this. This creates an opportunity in the form of almost a real-life experiment where you're looking at changing emissions across different parts of the city and urban areas and the globe. And we're going to try and see what we can learn from that for future air quality management efforts. And as Dilraz mentioned, if you have any questions, please send them in the Q&A box. We have some good folks here that are going to go through the questions, and we'll try and address as many of them towards the end of the webinar as possible. A couple of things we're not going to address. I'm not going to speak to any medical questions, as that is outside my area of expertise, and I don't want to get into answering questions that I don't believe I'm qualified to answer. So let's get started by talking about Qatar's social distancing strategy. So many places have opted to lockdown. The state of Qatar is not in lockdown, but we are under a stay-at-home order and restricted movement order. What that means is you can go out for the necessities, whether they be for groceries or for seeking medical treatment or going to pharmacies and so on. Restaurants are closed except for deliveries, but if you need to go out, of course, and get your groceries, that's the best way to do it. Our testing is based on contact tracing, so those that have tested positive, the state looks to those that they have been in contact with within X period of time, and looks to test those people to see if they have been exposed or are in fact infected. This approach prevents a larger number of infections by identifying infections earlier and removing these people from public contact, so either in self-quarantine or quarantine facilities that are set up by the state and medical services. This does result in a big jump and an increase in positive test rates, and this is something that we've seen over the past couple of weeks or so. And you can see this in the figure. For example, the figure on the bottom is a comparison from publicly available testing data in Qatar that looks at the number of new tests, which is in orange here, and the positive test rate. And you can see that there is a steady increase in terms of the number of new tests as well as the positive hit rate, and that's associated with a contact tracing approach. Over the past couple of days, we are beginning to see signs of a divergence here. I'm not sure whether that means or could be an indication that we are approaching an inflection point or perhaps reaching the peak. We currently have about 90% of our cases as active cases. The remaining 10% are mostly in the form of total recoveries. The fatality rate in the state of Qatar is very low. And we are looking at about 3.6% of the population, up to 3.64% of the population has been tested so far. I say up to because a number of those tests are repeated tests on the same individual to look at their recovery status. And we have a total infection rate of about 0.53% of the population, which means roughly 1 in every 190 or so people have tested positive. So now going to the question of air quality and what we're here about. What have we seen over the past period? Social distancing policies really started in the state of Qatar with the closure of all schools to students on March 10th. Now, the announcement was made on the 9th, effective the next day. All students had to stay home and start remote education. What we see, and what you can see in the figure here, are NO2 concentrations across the urban area from the different stations. So we operate about 5 stations across urban Doha, and you can see the data from these stations, and the green line represents the polynomial fit of the average trend from all the stations. We pick NO2 because NO2 is a good surrogate for anthropogenic or human-made emissions, mostly combustion-based emissions from traffic, construction, industry, maritime, and aviation. But in most cases, traffic is the main contributor to NO2 concentrations. Now, as I mentioned before, we did see an initial increase in NO2 concentrations during the first week. We suspect that may be due, and we'll talk a little bit more about it on the next slide, due to, once school closures were announced, parents are trying to figure out resources for their kids, trying to look at maybe perhaps stocking up on groceries and some supplies. So there's quite a bit of activity on the roads. The real drop in NO2 concentration started in the second week, where we started to see remote working policies enacted by Qatar Foundation and others. And then for the 5 or 6 weeks following that, you see this undulation effect where it goes up and goes down a little bit. And then you see a second dip towards the very end here, around the start of the holy month of Ramadan. And we'll talk a little bit more about how, what impact Ramadan has on these emissions as well. So if we look at things on aggregate, NO2 concentrations have dropped by about almost 20%. This is as averaged over the full 6 or 7 weeks of social distancing from the time it started. And then you see here in the bar graphs the changes associated with the individual weeks. So we had a bump of about 22%. Now, when I say dropped and increased, this is relative to a baseline period, which we take as the 2 weeks immediately prior to any kind of social distancing activity. We took this approach because we don't have long-term data over these stations, as these stations have been in operation for just a few years. Typically, what we would do is we'd look at concentrations around this particular week and compare this week to the previous years. However, the state of Qatar has seen tremendous increase in population and in development activities, so our emissions profile has been changing quite significantly. So comparing to past years provides a limited ability to look at COVID-related impacts rather than looking at impacts associated with increasing populations and development. So we took this approach when we do recognize that the longer you move from your baseline period, the less effective that comparison becomes, because you start having additional meteorological inputs, you have seasonal inputs. So we're transitioning into the summer months, and from a photochemical perspective, there's a lot more chemistry that's going to start happening and is happening in the atmosphere, and that can change and impact concentrations as well. But we're relatively confident that the first several weeks of social distancing comparison with the baseline should give us a good indication. So between the week 1 and week 2, we see a very strong transition from an increase of about 22% to a decrease of about almost 34%. So that is a huge 56% inflection in terms of NO2 concentrations. The week of March 15th, specifically Sunday, March 15th, saw remote working policy at Qatar Foundation, and then followed by a number of other employers and the state over the course of the weeks to come, and that's clearly displayed in the data here. We are seeing an increase in NO2 emissions, or we did observe an increase in NO2 emissions from the weeks following that of March 15th. So you can see that the difference between NO2 concentrations for that week and the baseline is decreasing, which means NO2 concentrations are slightly increasing. The cause of that is one for debate and scientific research. There's been a recent publication that looks at the concept of stay-at-home fatigue, and people feeling more safe at home with social distancing and looking at COVID positive cases, looking or appearing like they're under management, and people start either going out to the grocery store perhaps more often than they did in the first week, or maybe going to a park or something like that. And then, of course, we see during the last couple of weeks here with the start of Ramadan, another dip or increase in the difference of the decrease in NO2 concentrations. We're going to focus only on NO2 in these comparisons because I want to limit the amount of time that I spend talking about what we have observed and increase the amount of time for the Q&A session to get an understanding of what people want to know more about. Now, what we're looking at here is a diurnal figure, which basically shows concentrations from midnight to 11 p.m. As averaged over all the different sets of weeks. So the blue line that you see here is the baseline, which are the first 2 weeks prior to any kind of social distancing. And you can get an understanding of the amount of emissions by the area under the blue curve. And we see, of course, that is the largest area. That is our, let's say, business as usual scenario. The orange line is the average over all of the social distancing weeks. And you see, your morning peak in rush hour associated with rush hour traffic, a dip in the middle of the day, and then increases as you go along in the evening. With COVID response, of course, you see much smaller area, and that's smaller by about 20% that we've observed here. But then you also see this flattening in the evening hours, and that is associated with social distancing policies, including the closure of all places of business after 7 p.m. This was enacted early on, and then later moved to a total closure of all businesses with the exception of food outlets and groceries and pharmacies over the weekends. And then finally, the yellow curve is the same numbers that we're looking at, but for the first week of Ramadan. Qatar being a Muslim country that observes the month of Ramadan, we actually see quite a different signature in terms of traffic patterns and associated emissions and concentrations in NO2 during Ramadan and outside of Ramadan. And a lot of that can be explained by some of the behavior of the population during Ramadan. I've highlighted certain areas where you see some dips here associated with possibly this is could possibly be associated with suhoor time. Suhoor is basically the late night or early morning meal that Muslims take right before they start their fasting. You also see a broadening of the traffic peak in the morning due to the difference in starting of work hours. So your workday starts later and ends earlier. So you see some people who go to work earlier and some people who go to work at a later time, and then most people then leave earlier during the day, which gives you a mid or late afternoon dip in concentrations. And then there's another bump here associated potentially with iftar or tarawih prayers, which are the evening prayers that dominate Ramadan and religious activities in Ramadan. Now the question is, are these coherent patterns that are emerging as part of Ramadan and in a social distancing type of environment? And are these indications of movement activity during social distancing periods that perhaps should or should not be happening? Next, we want to talk about, well, what can we learn from all of these efforts, right? So these distributions and changes in air quality that we see are averaged over the entire urban area, over the 5 stations. But do we see the same kind of behavior at each of the stations? And the answer is no, because each of the stations serves a different purpose. For example, what you're looking at here are the total NO2 decreases over the entire 7-week period at each of the different stations, so QF00 through 04. And I'll explain to you the significance of that, and that's dependent mostly on the location of the stations. So QF02 and 01 are upwind and downwind stations. So QF02 is located upwind of the urban area. So we're looking at mostly at air masses before they enter the urban area. We expect to see the least amount of decrease in NO2 concentrations there because there's not a lot of people living in upwind of urban areas, so you don't expect a large decrease. And that's exactly what we see here with just a decrease of 9.3%. The downwind station, or the station furthermost to the southeast, is located in Al-Waqra. And as the predominant wind flow goes from the northwest to the southeast, you're blowing all of these emissions down to that area. And so any kind of emissions reductions will show the largest impact in these downwind sites, and that's exactly what we see here. So the station in Al-Waqra is showing almost a 32% decrease in NO2 concentrations. 00 and 03 are proper urban sites, so 19.5 and 24.2, which is right around the urban average. QF04 is located in an area that has exemptions in terms of some of the social distancing policy and movement restrictions associated with infrastructure development for both the World Cup as well as a lot of the roads and interchanges that are happening in the country. And we therefore see a lower decrease in NO2 emissions because there are some activities that are continuing in those areas. So very accurately and logically reflects the distribution of social movement restrictions, as well as changes in potential traffic patterns. What we see from this is that local air quality is very reactive to movement restrictions and emission reductions. As soon as I mentioned, as soon as we started, strong social distancing policies, we immediately saw that in NO2 concentrations. This is also replicated to an extent in ozone concentrations and in PM2.5 concentrations. Ozone and PM2.5 are secondary pollutants in the sense that they're not emitted directly, although PM2.5, a good part of it is emitted directly, but they are formed as a result of reactions, chemical reactions in the atmosphere. So ozone is a mixture, is created when you have volatile organic compounds and oxides of nitrogen coming together in the presence of sunlight. They react, and ozone is a byproduct of it. Both, of course, are harmful to human health, and which is why we monitor them and mitigate and manage them as much as possible. But doing these correlations with respect to social distancing policies becomes more challenging because you have more variables that have to be considered. And that's the reason why we're focusing on NO2. The figure at the bottom here is from OMI satellite data, and this was this data was pulled out of the NASA website, and it shows the average column NO2, so the amount of NO2 in the entire column of the atmosphere, or in this case the troposphere, over the baseline period, which is before social distancing, or 2 weeks before, and then during the period of social distancing. And you can see a substantial decrease in emissions associated with major urban areas. So this is Doha here, before and after. These are some of our upwind neighbors in Bahrain and in Saudi Arabia, and you can see decreases in those emissions there, as well as across the Arabian Gulf and Iran, where you can see substantial decreases there. In areas or countries where you experience total lockdowns, you would expect the impact on air quality to be more positive. In other words, a larger decrease in air pollutant concentrations. So in terms of future efforts, and I mentioned before that we're looking at almost a real-life experiment here that allows us, from an air quality management perspective, to test the effectiveness of different intervention strategies. So looking at the differences between the stations and looking at differences between local as well as transboundary or transported pollution that comes from upwind and goes further downwind into other areas, you can start to use that information to build a more impactful set of intervention strategies to manage air quality moving forward. And this is exactly what we intend to do in partnership with the Ministry of Municipality and Environment here in the country and the Ministry of Public Health, looking at capitalizing on this period to develop more targeted and, as I mentioned before, more impactful intervention strategies to reduce air pollution moving forward and improve air quality. So at this point, that concludes my presentation, my slides, and we'd like to open up the floor to any kinds of questions that you have been submitting throughout this webinar, and start more of a dialogue in the interactive part of the webinar. Dilras? Okay. So I had a question pop up on my screen, basically, and talking about. So there's a question related to does air quality in my area impact or affect my chances of either catching COVID or recovering from COVID if I get it? And that's those are two separate questions, but very good questions. Recent literature, and there's been a study from Harvard that has looked that has observed in the U.S. about a 15% decrease in recovery rates. So if you do become infected with COVID-19, if you have a 15% higher likelihood of death if you live in a more polluted county in the U.S. Than some of the cleaner counties. That study has come out of the U.S. Additional studies are ongoing throughout different parts of the world, and we'll hear more about those impacts in different parts of the world. But air pollution basically does appear to reduce the body's ability to respond and fight the virus if you do become infected. So those of us that live in cleaner environments are less disadvantaged, so to speak. Now, does air pollution increase my chance of getting COVID, or does it increase my chance of exposure to the virus? There are new studies coming out of Italy and also those from in China that have found tracers of the virus in particulate matter. So these are basically small particles in air that are prevalent at different levels in different countries, depending on a number of factors, including traffic and urbanization and industry and the like. So the studies have found some prevalence of the virus in airborne particulates in areas that have high infection rates. What that means in terms of increasing chances for me getting it or the like, those links are not yet clearly delineated, but this is exactly what ongoing research is looking at addressing.
Thank you so much, Mohammed, for answering that question. We obviously had a quick technical glitch where I didn't unmute myself. However, I'm back, and we will continue with the question and answer session. Thank you so much. We've had a whole lot of questions coming in. If I may request all of our participants to please post the questions in the Q&A tab as opposed to the chat tab, that would be much appreciated. But here you go, Mohammed, with your first question. Are you ready?
Yes, please.
Okay. So our first question, obviously, people want to know how is QEERI supporting the country's fight against COVID? You spoke about air quality. Is there anything else that QEERI is doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So even within the Environment and Sustainability Center, we're looking at a number of ways in terms of supporting, the national fight against COVID. We have been testing disinfectants that are used by a number of different entities in the state for all of the disinfection activities, both ambient as well as indoors, to ensure that the quality of the disinfectants is at the level that is expected for what was procured. We have the Water Center that's looking at research in terms of water and wastewater and how that can add to the fight against COVID, whether it's in the form of prevalence of disinfectants in wastewater and how to manage that, or potentially even looking at a number of COVID-related activities. And we have an upcoming webinar on Tuesday by Dr. Jenny Lawler, and she'll be speaking directly to that. From an energy perspective, we also have an equivalent webinar on Thursday by Dr. Veronica Bermudez, and she will be looking at energy efforts as well as some of the efforts deployed by that center in terms of looking at COVID statistics in the country and potentially developing a model that helps us understand where we're headed with the multitude of different social distancing policies that we're enacted in the country. You're still muted.
Okay, there you go. Okay, this is new to all of us, so we're all learning as we go, but I'm guessing now you can hear me. Thank you, Mohammed, for talking about the next two seminars. Quick reminder, the next one is on Tuesday, that's in 2 days at 10 a.m., and that will look at the water perspective. On Thursday at 10 a.m., we will look at the energy perspective. Okay, so for the next question, are you collaborating with any of the national entities? I know you mentioned MOPH. Is there anyone else you're working closely with for air quality, especially related to COVID-19 and beyond? I mean, but let's focus on COVID-19 first, if you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, a critical partnership that we have is with the Ministry of Public Health. The Ministry of Public Health is basically in charge of the COVID response, and from a health perspective. We have been working with the Ministry of Public Health in terms of sharing our air quality data with them, so that their epidemiologists and medical experts can look at greater links and understanding greater links between air quality as well as either ability to recover or potentially even susceptibility to COVID infection. We are collaborating on a number of fronts, including a bioaerosol study that looks at indoor air quality and the prevalence of pathogens in indoor air quality. This could be, from fungi, bacteria, and expanded to viruses as well. We work very closely with the Ministry of Municipality and Environment, and that's the entity that's mostly charged with environmental protection in the country. Looking at developing these intervention strategies and upping the game when it comes to air quality management in general, but specifically when it comes to COVID-related challenges. Next question. Okay, yes, I've mastered unmuting myself along with my camera. The next question is about all the data you shared. How often do you collect these data? And what is your source? I know you went into the explanations. I believe we got these questions before we did that. And also we had another question which said, if these 5 stations are statistically significant for research purposes in general for NO2 emissions beyond the current situation, and can we take this data as an indicator for what happens across Qatar? I believe you have 5 stations, which is spread across different parts. So is that an indicator for what happens across Qatar? What are your thoughts? Okay, I'll answer the last question first, only because I'll probably forget it if I don't. My response to that would be no. That is probably not an indicator in terms of what happens across the country as a whole, because we are focused on an urban area. And emissions in an urban area are tied more to the human activity within that urban area. When we set up our network, we focused on Greater Doha because that's where 95% of the population of the country resides. The remaining 5% are in urban centers to the north, to the west, and to the south. And of course, the clusters are not as large in terms of population density as in urban Doha. Now, going back to the question on the screen, which is, what's the source of the data? So the source of the data is, as I mentioned, our 5 stations. The data frequency, we operate our stations at research levels. So we receive a data point every minute for a range of different air pollutants, including your typical, what are called criteria air pollutants. So these are the air pollutants that are typically managed for human health perspective. So particulate matter, PM 2.5, ozone, oxides of nitrogen, NO and NO2. We measure or monitor carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, methane, the full suite of meteorological parameters. We spend an enormous amount of effort in terms of ensuring the quality of the data that comes out of these stations. And I'd really like to take the opportunity right now to acknowledge the team that's working on this. Not only is this team dedicated and a hardworking team on normal circumstances, but keeping the stations operational during such a period in a global pandemic comes with additional responsibilities. We've enacted specific protocols to ensure the health and safety of our people during the activities where we go out to the stations on a daily basis, making sure that the equipment are operational properly, doing the proper maintenance, upkeep, and keeping the quality of the data high. Adam Skillen is managing that effort on our end, and he's been doing an absolutely amazing job during this period. I would like to specifically mention Environment Qatar for their efforts. They've been with us from the beginning, keeping these stations operational, maintaining them, and moving things forward. So that's the source of our data. We have strict QA/QC and standard operating procedures in terms of calibrations. We do zero span checks on a nightly basis. This might be a little too technical, but we go above and beyond from a research perspective to ensure the highest quality data that we can get. In addition to some of these standard pollutants and meteorological parameters, we also have the ability to look at intermediary byproducts and help us understand the chemistry that's specific to this region.
Okay. So while we are on that topic of how we've been compiling data, I'm going to ask you a few questions that popped up related to some of these pollutants, right? Specifically NO2. So one of the questions that we got is if it's possible that the increase in NO2 concentrations in the second week is directly related to the emissions lingering in the atmosphere, or is it a specific spike that we saw that week? And the other question we have is...
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
Yeah, it is it possible that the increase in NO2 concentrations in the second week that you mentioned is related to the emissions lingering in the atmosphere, or is it a fresh sort of spike? And one more question before I let you answer is there an impact of cross-boundary movements on air quality, including NO2?
So both very good questions. The first question, it is unlikely that we're looking at lingering emissions for that period of time. The atmosphere is a very dynamic medium, and it's constantly moving. You do get periods of relative calm. Those typically can last from an hour to a few hours, depending on the season and the conditions, but they typically do not last for a day or several days where you just have this stagnation event, at least not in this area. It can occur under certain geographic conditions, but not in the circumstances that we have. So unlikely that these are lingering effects. Now, the second question in terms of transboundary transport of pollutions, this is a very important question for the state of Qatar because of the size, the area of the state of Qatar. As far as most countries go, the state of Qatar is a relatively small country, which means a larger percent of your pollution profile is going to be transported from upwind or from different places. It's important to know how much of our pollution profile is under our control and our ability to mitigate and manage, and how much of it requires regional cooperation in terms of reducing air pollution and increasing air quality.
Okay, that brings me directly to another question. It isn't related to to the topic at hand. However, since you mentioned, collaboration, especially when it comes to cross-boundary movements on air quality, how has it been since, since the blockade? Has that impacted our research, or, how would you see the blockade for Qatar and, the research that happens in Qatar?
You're talking specifically about the blockade?
Yes, specifically about the blockade.
Okay.
So has it hindered the research, because are we still getting research numbers from our neighbors, or are we stuck, or how does it work?
So, one of the things that we've seen in the state of Qatar over the past 3 years is greater reliance on national resources. In the past, there may have been greater reliance on regional or international resources. And one of the co-benefits, if you want to call it, from the blockade is we have seen national stakeholders looking at internal resources. So we, as an institute, have had a plethora of national stakeholders and state entities reaching out to us and asking for our assistance with this, that, or the other. And this has provided us with an opportunity to respond at a time of need, both during the period of the blockade as well as during this COVID period, and up our game, so to speak, in terms of the value that we add, the research that we add, but also some of the services that we add as a research institute.
One very popular question that I'm seeing in the chat window is, I do have slides of at least another 10 questions, so I think we're going to be here a while. However, I need to ask this because, we've had at least 6 or 7 people asking us the same question. Will we see this positive impact on air quality once we all go back to work, once, the work from home, remote working is lifted, or will we see, a complete, collapse in air quality? As an expert, what are your thoughts?
Right. So, this is the question, right? And I'm going to get a little theoretical here. What we're seeing now is a glimpse of how things can be, not just in this form, but potentially even better if we look at better prioritization in terms of air pollution and improving air quality. One of the things that I see in the news media or on Twitter or so on are people putting up pictures in India saying, hey, look, we can see the Himalayas and we haven't seen these in decades. The most recent one I saw was a photograph showing Bahrain from Dammam in Saudi Arabia. Now, I'm not sure as to the accuracy or authenticity of those photographs, but that's the kind of potential that we're looking at. And my sincere hope is that people like what they see with respect to some of the improvements in air quality at local and global levels, and people insist that this become more of the norm, so that when we do start going back to business as usual or the new norm, whatever it may be, we pay closer attention and greater consideration for air quality, its impact on the number of lives that air pollution takes on a global level every year, and potentially even some of the downstream impacts towards climate change, right? Because these emission reductions also come with reductions in emissions of carbon dioxide. Now, are the reductions associated with social distancing restrictions for a period of a month or 2 or 6 or even a year going to have a dent in terms of climate change? Likely not on the short term, but if we look at adopting these measures and revising how we do business as usual, how we work, can we look at a greater reliance in terms of remote working, or even greater reliance in terms of remote communication strategies or technologies like the one that we're utilizing right now to decrease our movement and therefore decrease our emissions? Can that have a lasting impact on both air quality, as well as potentially start looking at some of the gains in climate change that we, as a global community, need to prioritize. It is my sincere hope that the answer is in the affirmative, but that only happens with engagement, public engagement, research engagement, policy and decision-maker engagement. So, keep the discussions going, keep the insistence, and inshallah, as a global community, this is the direction in which we're going to move in.
Inshallah, let's hope for the best as we go forward. Your next question is, how I think we've spoken about it, but if you want to elaborate a little more, how was the rate of emissions calculated? A quick answer, please.
Okay, so we weren't talking about rate of emissions. We weren't measuring emissions. We were measuring concentrations in the atmosphere. Now, the calculation for, I assume the question means, how were the changes calculated? So, as I mentioned, we looked at a 2-week period prior to the start of any social distancing, and we looked at the average of those 2 periods compared to the average of the individual weekly periods that followed. And from a percentage-wise, we basically took the average for this week, let's say, subtracted from it the average of the baseline period, divided it by the baseline period, and then that's multiplied by 100, and that's your percent change relative to the baseline period. We were not measuring emissions directly. We were measuring concentrations in the air. Emissions is what comes out of a particular source, whether it's a tailpipe or a plant stack or something. Ambient concentrations are what you and I are breathing on a daily basis.
Thank you for the explanation. I must admit you lost me a bit there in between with all the science talk, but thank you for breaking it down for me and all of the participants who are like me and are not quite sciencey. All right, next question. So is this a common trend? Are you seeing a decrease? I know you mentioned India and how we can see the Himalayas. I think that was a meme, by the way. But is this a common trend across the world? Are you seeing studies from, say, China, which has a very high pollution rate? Are you seeing trends from other parts of the world in terms of air pollution and COVID-19?
Yeah, so we're beginning to see the data come out from different parts of the world. NASA, European Space Agency, the Chinese have shown a lot of satellite data that shows, concentrations as observed from space before and after social distancing, and over the same location, during social distancing and in the years prior to that. And you see some substantial decreases in air quality. I've had discussions with colleagues in a number of places around the world, including Europe, North America, and in the East. And a lot of places that are observing lockdowns or social distancing are seeing improvements in air quality and decreases in pollutant concentrations. One of the things that I have seen in these discussions is areas that are in lockdown are actually experiencing greater improvement in air quality than areas that are in some kind of movement restriction or different levels of social distancing. And that is logical if you think about it. A lockdown means, complete lockdown with very, very few exceptions. Movement restrictions means something different, but generally is regarded as a greater ability to move around within certain guidelines. So yeah, we have seen that in different parts of the world.
While we're talking about comparison, let me also ask you, are we seeing a comparison between, or have you done a comparison between the same period this year and say previous years within Qatar? Is there a significant change?
Yeah, so we are looking at that, and as I mentioned in the presentation, that was one of the first areas where we wanted to focus. However, the state of Qatar is somewhat of an outlier in the sense that, alhamdulillah, it's been experiencing a really incredible growth rate and development rate over the past several years. And so as part of the norm, our emissions and our activity increases as we go along. I'll give you one example. Last year, we saw a tremendous improvement in air quality in urban areas in the state of Qatar associated with PM10 and PM2.5. So these are the particulate matter. And, you know, we've been doing some studies to try and understand where these gains are coming from. Part of it is meteorological, as in a change in the flow patterns in the region relative to other years. But another part of it is the maturation of a lot of the infrastructure projects that have been ongoing in the city and in the country as a whole over the past several years. If you live in Doha, you know that you know, starting last year and going further back, mobility has become much easier in Greater Doha than it was, let's say, 3 or 4 years ago. It took me less time to get from point A to point B yesterday or last year than it did 3 or 4 years ago. And that's because we have, you know, more highways, more ways of getting around. We have, you know, the rail system or the underground system that moves people in a more sustainable way. We're looking at a lot of areas that moved from roundabouts to signalized intersections, and that facilitated the flow of traffic. So the less time you spend on the road, the less emissions are coming out of your tailpipe. And therefore, you expect to see an equivalent decrease in air pollution concentrations. So for us, it's more challenging to look at the interannual differences because we're not at that steady state where you can then come and say, okay, well, this decrease now is related purely to COVID response measures. And that's why we didn't look at that or focus on that in this comparison.
Okay, that sounds quite insightful, and thank you so much. Now for the next question, I believe we have spoken already about transboundary pollutions. So I am going to move to the next question because you know, my question box is absolutely going you know, berserk with the number of questions. Thank you so much. Please keep them coming.
This specific question is related to, well, how do you take out the effect of transboundary?
Social distance.
A lot of that is done by looking at you know, measurement data from measurement stations that are completely upwind, so on the border of your country, as well as from modeling activities. So, you know, whatever you measure at the border, it's like, you know, in your property. Whatever you measure at your property line, this is what's coming to you from outside. Whatever you measure inside is what's been transported to you and what you added to it. So if you look at the differences there, you can get an understanding of some of the transboundary transport. And of course, one of the most important ways to quantify transboundary transport pollution is looking at modeling platforms. And, you know, Dr. Christopher Fontoukis, who's one of the moderators in terms of looking at some of the questions, and I suspect he's the one that passed that question on, so I can mention him and the work that his team does. He leads our modeling platform. So we operate a photochemical modeling platform that looks at the meteorology in the region, the emissions in the region, how the meteorology moves emissions around from different sources, and the chemistry that's involved in the process as well.
So this is a question I know you can speak for hours on. However, very quickly, in bullet point format, can you tell us what the Environment and Sustainability Center at QEERI actually does beyond the COVID-19 related research? Please keep it short.
Absolutely. The Environment and Sustainability Center is a group of very, very hardworking researchers that focus on air quality applications. So as I mentioned, looking at measuring air quality, modeling air quality, and developing policy solutions, and basically providing advice for policy and decision makers in terms of intervention strategies that can help improve air quality in the country. From a climate change perspective, we look at the impacts of climate change on the region, but with a specific focus on the state of Qatar and even more specific focus on the urban area of Greater Doha, because that's where, as I mentioned, the vast majority of our population lives. Look at understanding our vulnerability and trends. So how quickly are things, is the atmosphere or our temperatures warming in our region, in our country, in our city? What that means for us in terms of increased heat stress, looking at potential extremes in rainfall patterns, extremes in dust storms. Where we're going in that direction, are we looking at greater intensity dust storms as opposed to larger number of dust storms? Or are we looking at greater intensity rainfall events as opposed to less or more rainfall? We're also looking at impacts on life cycle impacts on large projects like infrastructure, oil and gas activities, a lot of the long-lasting projects in the country. How do you expect climate change to impact the life cycle? So if you had this planned for, let's say, 50 years, is a warmer climate in our region and warming at X or a specific rate going to impact that life cycle assessment? What does that mean from an economic perspective, from a safety perspective, and also from a health perspective? How are these changes going to impact our lives, and how are they going to impact our productivity? So there's two elements to that, not just health, but productivity. If you live in an environment that's less conducive to any kind of outdoor activity, how productive does that make you? And what do you need to do in terms of developing adaptation strategies? So looking at mitigating, reducing emissions, working with national entities to understand and reduce our emissions, but then also look at increasing our resiliency as a country in terms of developing adaptation strategies. So if we're not able to control this temperature increase, what do we do to manage our lives, our property, our economy, our health within a changing environment? Water quality, I want to give a big shout out to the water quality group. They're doing a lot of work in terms of understanding water quality in Qatar, providing services to national stakeholders in terms of water quality testing, developing environmentally friendly biocides that help us rely more on environmentally friendly activities as opposed to some of the ones that are in existence that have a greater environmental impact. And then looking at also assisting, the country and national stakeholders in terms of the COVID response, understanding questions related to disinfectant concentrations in wastewater streams, how we as a country can deal with that and develop plans in terms of moving forward with it. Sustainability, looking at really developing a definition of sustainability in our region. Sustainability, a lot of people talk about sustainability, try and ask somebody what sustainability means, and you will always get that 5 to 10 second pause. And that's mostly due to the fact that sustainability is somewhat general in terms of its definition. We are looking at developing a definition that's encompassing and inclusive of our environment here. Green is typically defined as sustainable or regarded as sustainable. For us here, green is actually quite exhaustive in terms of water that you have to produce, carbon dioxide emissions associated with that water, and so on. So looking at brown as a sustainable option as opposed to green in this region, and then looking at developing frameworks, piloting activities at the QEERI level, at the Qatar Foundation level, and scaling them up nationally, and looking at, in general, developing and enhancing environmental sustainability related solutions for the country.
Thank you so much for that fairly brief answer.
I go on for a long time.
I am aware, Mohammed. So the next question is a little more practical. So the gyms are obviously closed. So how would would you recommend exercising outside? Especially, does that make social distancing worse? Or, do you, and if you're exercising outside, do you need to wear masks? What's your thoughts?
Okay, so a lot of the research literature that's coming out now is looking at the viability rate of the virus in air, how long it can survive in droplets that are either exhaled from, a coughing infected person, a sneezing infected person, or just from talking, and on surfaces, as well as in air pollution particles. So the jury's still out on that. There's a lot of research that's happening, and we will learn more and more as the days progress. But there is increasing and general consensus that we should all wear a mask anytime you decide to leave your house. The kind of mask at this point is not as important. I mean, of course, some masks are better at keeping some of this stuff out than others, but it's important to have a mask on, especially when you're interacting with other individuals. Now, in terms of outdoor exercise, you can start looking at times of day. So I don't know if you recall when showed the diurnal profile, you have a peak in the morning hours associated with primary pollutants, and a peak in the afternoon hours associated with secondary pollutants. But typically, the evening hours, as far as Doha is concerned, have lower concentrations in terms of both primary and secondary pollutants than the early morning hours. So if you're looking at any kind of outdoor activity or exercise later on in the afternoon, early evening, it's probably the best time to do that. And put your mask on. Mike.
Thank you, Mohammed. There was a question that popped up that I've wondered about as well. Is there any specific reason you focus on NO2 emissions as opposed to, I don't know, carbon dioxide or some other pollutants? Is NO2 picked for a specific reason? What's the thought process for that?
Yeah, so we did pick NO2 because it is a surrogate for anthropogenic emissions. The main sources of NO2 in an urban area are, as I said, combustion processes that can occur in the engines of cars and construction sites and airplanes and shipping and so on. You can also get NO2 as a function of some of the photochemistry, titration of ozone, but then you actually need NO present from combustion emissions for that titration. But there are some natural sources, including lightning, NOx. So lightning generates oxides of nitrogen. We have had a few rain showers here. We've had a couple of thunderstorms, but typically during this social distancing period, typically our rain is limited to a certain period of time of the year and not heavily associated with thunderstorms. So our natural contribution in terms of NOx and NO2 emissions are very limited, which gives us, the ability to say, well, okay, so NO2 is a primer for human activity. CO2, for example, you have very high ambient CO2 concentrations. Our baseline is high to begin with, so calculating differences associated with social distancing policies becomes more challenging. And the same, as I mentioned in the presentation, with respect to some of the secondary pollutants.
Okay, so since you just mentioned about rain and storm, this comes right at you. What happened 2 days ago? Did you see? Did any of your forecasting predict that? Did you see it, or were you? Was it a surprise for you as well, like all of us?
I think the best person to speak to that is Christos. So Christos, perhaps you can turn on your mic and in camera and help answer that question, please?
We will just be joined by Dr. Christos Fontokis. He is the senior scientist who leads the program at QEERI under Dr. Mohammed Ayub. Christos, if you could please turn on your microphone.
Hello.
And
can you hear me?
welcome. Yes, I can hear you, and I can.
Could you repeat the
question, I can see it as well. It's on the screen. Did the storm 2 days ago catch you as much by surprise as it did us, or did you see that fluctuation in your forecast and calculations?
So yes, as Mohammed said, we operate an air quality modeling platform in QEERI. We produce 72-hour forecasts every day. We focus a lot on dust storms, but also meteorology, of course, is one part of our forecasting capabilities. The rain storms are usually they are very unpredictable, I would say. So the model, as far as I remember, was able to predict some of the rain, but not the intensity. And sometimes, even the hour of the day is also very challenging to predict. So but I would like to say that our main focus is in air quality. Of course, these are related, air quality and meteorology. But so far, we have seen that we are doing quite well with the dust storms, and this is our main focus.
If I could jump in real quick here, I actually have some questions that are popping up on my chat. So, Rami asks, have you looked at the effect of social distancing measures on total NOx, including NO, not just NO2? And we have looked at that. Our NO concentrations are quite erratic, and you get these large spikes in NO concentrations that really have a strong impact in terms of any averages that you create and kind of model things. So we found that it was more difficult and more challenging to identify any patterns associated with NOx because of these, I wouldn't call them outliers, but these intense spikes. We're looking at a median approach in terms of looking at median concentrations as opposed to averaging to get a better understanding and handling of NOx. But I see the reason why you asked that question, and we are considering that. KD also asks a couple of questions in terms of how long the virus survives on particle. The jury's still out on that one. Research is continuing, but I don't have any clear guidance in terms of the research literature at this point. The indications are that it may be more viable for longer periods than have been previously assumed, but the research is ongoing. And also a question, do you suppose social distancing and similar measures can be utilized post-COVID as air quality mitigation measures for the World Cup in 2022? So, what a post-COVID world looks like and how that will impact, mega sporting events like the World Cup and those that will come before the World Cup are going to be very, very interesting events to kind of understand and manage. Are we going to be in a completely post-COVID environment where we're looking at some changes in our behavior, but nothing major in terms of being able to put people in the stadium? Or are we going to be looking at something that looks very different from today? It's kind of almost like a crystal ball, but for sure, some of the apparent experiments that we're seeing with different effects of air quality based on different social distancing adoption guidelines are going to add to toolbox of air quality management tools moving forward. Yes.
Okay, Mohammed, it's 11:15. We are obviously going beyond the time we have allocated, and we do understand that many of you have other commitments. So we will take the last three questions, starting with this. So one of our participants want to know if we use computational fluid dynamic data or simulations to investigate more about the spread of COVID-19 through air. While we are on that topic, I would also like to know and ask how much of computational processes do we use in your sort of air quality modeling or climate change studies? What role does computing play as a whole for your program, for your center, and is there any specific work being done for COVID-19 spread through the air?
So, computational processes are a critical part of what we do. As Chris just explained, our photochemical modeling platform is a critical part of our forecasting capabilities. Now, in terms of the question related to computational fluid dynamics or CFD, we have not looked at that question. I am aware that a number of research groups around the world are looking at this, and I've seen some data related to potential virus shedding from, let's say, an infected individual that's jogging versus one that's walking. There's a number of different test cases that can be looked at. The Environment Sustainability Center is limiting itself to atmospheric dynamics in terms of looking at COVID response research. However, we do have a computational materials processing center that I need to have a longer discussion with in terms of getting an understanding of some of the work that they're doing in response to some of the research work that they're doing in response to COVID.
Okay, so another one of the
next speakers can speak to that.
Another one of the questions, this is the second last question. I know there are a lot of questions that's coming in, and we do want to answer all of it, but we also have to be mindful of the time. If you really would like your question answered and it's not been covered, please feel free to email us on QEERI-communication@hbku.edu.qa, and we will be happy to try and answer questions via email if possible. But we have to stick to limitations of time today. So the second last question for the day is, what measures would you put in place to check the increase or decrease that you witness around Tarawih time, which is in the evenings?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. So we expect, we're going to compare changes in traffic patterns and associated NO2 or pollutant concentrations for Ramadan this year and Ramadan in previous years. We have measurement data looking at the relative change between the pre-Ramadan days or post-Ramadan days and Ramadan for that specific year, and looking at the relative changes this year versus last year. The reason why I say this because of social distancing measures, all of the mosques in the country are closed. So public prayers or public gatherings for prayers are not in effect as they are typically during Ramadan. And that means people are praying more in their homes. But since we're seeing the inflection, there are some movements before and potentially after, and there's a little bit of a dip at the time of Tarawih prayers, which is between 8 and 9. Closer to 8, yeah. So that's how we want to look at it. Again, at this point, we only have about a week or 8, 9, 10 days of Ramadan to play with. Once we get further into the month, one of the things we've seen in the past is actually an increasing effect as the month goes on, especially as we approach Eid, and especially in the nighttime hours. We see greater activity and a lot more movement in the hours after Tarawih prayers, because people are going out, they're eating out, they're getting together with friends and family, and they're buying gifts in preparation for Eid and preparing themselves for it. So are we going to experience similar patterns this year as we've seen in the past few years? How much of that can be attributable to social distancing, and how much of that is an indicator of, much as I hate to say it, non-compliance when it comes to social distancing?
Okay. So to leave this discussion on a more positive note, and as an expert who's been studying air quality and pollution for a good 20 years, and also as a father of 5 who's raising kids, who will be the future generation, what would you say are some things that we can do as the general public, during this period, during the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond, to protect the environment and to battle climate change? What can we as individuals do to contribute towards this change?
Well, first and foremost, and thank you for this question, be safe. You and your family, stay close to your loved ones, take care of your loved ones. Who you're with at this time matters, and you're spending a lot more time with them. Make use of that time, strengthen your bonds, get closer, and stay safe together. From an environmental and air quality perspective, take this opportunity to consider and reconsider your daily routines before and now. How much of your activities and your movements are actually as necessary as you perhaps thought they were. Look at how you can reduce the amount of time that you spend moving around in any kind of environmentally impactful form. Look at potentially utilizing more sustainable transport options like the metro or any kind of mass transit that spreads the emissions of a number of people within one source, as opposed to getting into a car as an individual. Carpooling, and I want to leave you with just kind of one statistic that we've been working on as part of the sustainability program. And we've looked at QEERI. So QEERI is about 165 employees, researchers, and staff. And we wanted to look at, what have been the offsets in carbon dioxide emissions associated with us, QEERI staff, traveling or not traveling anymore from home to the office and back. Just that simple trip that we do every day. Go to the office at 7 o'clock in the morning, whatever time it is you go, and whatever time it is you come back. And we made some assumptions based on these people. So the people at QEERI, looking at an average distance between the office and home, assuming a certain number of people carpool and others don't. You have just one driver in a vehicle as opposed to 3 passengers and 1 driver or so. And the type of vehicles, the technology, and so on. And one of the estimates that we've been able to come up with is for QEERI alone, so that's a staff of about 165 people, an average trip of about 10 round trip of about 10 kilometers from your home to your office results in almost 921 kilograms of carbon dioxide offsets. In other words, we reduced our carbon dioxide emissions by almost a ton every single day, just from working from home. So now translate that to all of the other activities that you do in your daily life, and just be mindful of how you can reduce those activities and perhaps maybe do things in a little bit more efficient way, and be mindful of your own carbon footprint, whether it's from a climate change perspective or from an air quality perspective. Thank you very much for your attention and for your time. This has been a phenomenal experience for me. It's one thing to be able to present and to be able to get instant feedback But I am scrolling through the questions as they're coming in and looking.
And we will respond by email, because I have to jump in. We are almost half an hour past, and we still have over 140 people who are tuned into us. I feel nothing but gratitude. Thank you so much for taking your time, ladies and gentlemen, to spend this morning with us on a Sunday morning, the first day of the week. It means a lot to us. Quickly, if I may just remind you, we have 2 more seminars coming up. Dr. Jenny Lawler joins us on Tuesday at 10 a.m. and Dr. Veronica Bermudez joins us on Thursday at 10 a.m. I will be sending out an email with the links to register to this in case you've missed it out. And we do look forward to having you join us once again. On behalf of our Executive Director, Dr. Varmir, Muhammad Ayub, and the entire team who's been working to set this up, including the HPKU Communications and Marketing team. Thank you so much, all of you, and stay safe. And thank you so much once again. Ramadan Kareem.
Ramadan Kareem. Thank you.